Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our final and earliest Eunomia policy talk at the Resource Recycling Conference. Again, to introduce myself, my name is Michael Wasserman. I'm a senior consultant at Eunomia. This morning, we're going to be talking about recycled content commitments. I'm joined by Emily Topaldo, the executive director of the U.S. Plastic Pack, and Megan Lane, manager for circularity and public affairs at Ball Corporation. So before we jump into some good discussion, can I have each of you provide a bit more introduction for yourselves?
Thanks, Michael. So I joined the Pact when we launched almost 3 years ago now, which is pretty crazy. Before that, I worked for a small mission-driven consulting firm now known as Stina Inc., formerly More Recycling. And prior to that, I was with the American Chemistry Council for almost 10 years, working in their regulatory and plastics division. So lots of cat herding experience, which brings me to where I am today.
And Public Affairs Manager for the Ball Corporation. Here we go. And been there about 2.5 years. Prior to that, though, I was at the City and County of Denver, working in their solid waste management division, working on ways to try to recover recyclable materials, working on strategic planning and policy and things of that nature. And then prior to that, I had brief stints both in zero waste events, like at the Red Rocks Amphitheater and places like that, and in solid waste consulting.
Great. Thank you both very much for being here. So this morning's talk is about recycled content commitments. We heard on Monday from New Jersey how they're implementing their recycled content legislation. There's several other states who have passed recycled content mandates in the last several years. There's quite a growing movement in the recycled content space. The U.S. Plastics Pack has one of their targets focused on recycled content, in addition to a lot of other industry commitments around recycled content. But also what has been discussed in some other panel sessions is about how there needs to be a lot more supply of material. So we're at the Resource Recycling Conference, and there needs to be quite an increase in the amount of recycling to hit those targets. So do you think you can share a bit more about how much, on the aluminum side for Ball and plastic for the Plastic Pact, how much these recycling rates need to improve for these mandates or targets to be met? Megan, maybe first.
Sure, no problem. So generally, just full disclosure, right? PCR requirements don't necessarily always apply to aluminum packaging. Like they have been targeting plastics packaging generally. But even when they have, our recycled content, we're pretty lucky in the sense that it's around 73% as an average across the industry. And so we've far exceeded any of the minimums that are out there. But I will say, we are also seeing that we're essentially having to import some of our recycled content from Europe, South America, Mexico, and Canada because the recycling rates in the United States are so low.
I'm thinking back to yesterday. I don't know if any folks sat in on the last session, and there were questions related to EPR and, we need more supply, but then lots of questions about the market. And, we know prices, particularly for plastics, recycled plastics, are really low, and it doesn't help when virgin plastic prices get lower, then everything just all gets pushed down. And on the one hand, we have companies saying, oh, we need the supply, we can't get the supply. And then on the other hand, we have communities, haulers and reclaimers saying, we got it, we're sitting on it, and we're not moving it. So there's a big disconnect. And one of the things that we are working on with the Plastics Pact activators or our members, we call them activators because they're the ones taking action, is we need to move toward long-term contracts with floor prices because we have to help stabilize what is definitely an economic challenge. And to Michael's question, Eunomia helped us do some really cool modeling work last year I think, around our target to use more PCR. So one of our 4 targets is achieving a 30% average by weight use of specifically post-consumer recycled content across the PACT's packaging portfolio. So our latest set of data, the PACT cohort represents roughly 5.9 million metric tons of plastic packaging that's sold into the US market. So thinking about roughly 30% of that being PCR. And it's the research that Eunomia helped us with was really eye-opening for our members. So one of the takeaways that I think surprised people was we found that even with a 50% recycling rate just for plastics, we would only be able to achieve roughly a 15.5% again by weight usage of PCR. And that was really eye-opening to a lot of people. And it wasn't until we started looking at a scenario of unconstrained supply of post-consumer recycled content where you're pushing sort of technical maximum usage of PCR in a variety of different packaging formats, plastic packaging formats, with PET beverage bottles really carrying the weight of that PCR usage, that you start to see numbers in the 40% range in terms of averaging PCR usage. So we need so much coming into the system and the value for it coming into the system to really kind of make a difference. We know right now we're at like 8% usage across that portfolio of almost 6 million metric tons.
Yeah, thank you for the plug, Emily,
Sure.
For Eunomia. I think another interesting part of that study as well was that a lot of the recycled content is not going to packaging. It's going to other more open loop end uses. So can you talk a bit about the importance of just closing the loop on recycled content and making sure it's going back to packaging? How do we ensure that it's not going to these downgrading sources but becoming new packaging material and staying in the system as long as possible?
Yeah, I know there are different schools of thought, and our organization is agnostic at this point in terms of dictating where the PCR goes. But I know a lot of the consumer goods companies in particular really would like first right of refusal to the incoming supply of PCR. But to your point, it does go to a lot of different sources, basically based on who is willing to pay the most with the least amount of processing or reprocessing. There are some areas, though, I think, where we can turn on greater usage of PCR in a relatively short amount of time and not have to hit some of those quality specifications that are required for personal care products or food contact packaging. So one of the things I think that even companies sometimes forget is all of the tertiary and secondary packaging that they use, and just all of the opportunities that exist in that arena. And it's, for the end consumer, it's out of sight, out of mind. For a lot of packaging engineers, it's out of sight, out of mind, because it lives with logistics, lives with the distribution chain. But there are definitely a lot of opportunities to drive both reusables as well as higher percentages of PCR that maybe don't need to be that really high quality stuff.
Yeah, sorry. And Megan, you mentioned that the aluminum industry is importing a lot of material from abroad. So can you talk a bit about the importance of, creating a stable local supply chain of material and potentially what other benefits come from that, whether it's, economic or other?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you that don't know, even though aluminum is the most recycled beverage container in the United States right now, we're only recycling 45.2%. And it has some of the strongest economics when it comes to recycling. Right now, we estimate that we're essentially landfilling about $3 billion worth of aluminum on an annual basis. And if we were able to achieve a 90% recycling rate for aluminum, which is a goal of the Ball Corporation, it would inject essentially $7.8 billion on an annual basis into the U.S. economy. And one of the reasons why we have these like really rigorous recycling rate goals of trying to achieve 90% recycling globally by 2030 is because of its ability to deliver on our customers' climate goals, right? So we want to see a minimum of an 85% recycled content, which is higher than the average right now, which is at 73%. And we want to see it even higher than that. And the reason for that is we just published our climate transition plan, and essentially, like, what is our pathway to achieve net zero? And essentially, if we're able to dramatically increase recycling rates in the U.S., our estimates that we have to hit about 83%, we'll be able to achieve net zero much more quickly and to help our customers to deliver on their climate goals, because it's 55% of our pathway. And that's really significant. So essentially, like, without achieving circularity and through increasing our recycled content, like, we're not going to meet our goals in the near term. We need some sort of driver to really increase those recycling rates in the U.S. in a very short period of time.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, Emily, we talked a bit about this just before, and you mentioned it in your last response as well, but there are a lot of opportunities in tertiary packaging, pallets for reuse. So how does that, both fit into the climate conversation and also fit into this talk about meeting recycled content commitments?
Sure. I think the climate piece is coming up more and more, particularly as companies are now looking at how they report their Scope 3 emissions. So really connecting those dots for people is helpful to further the goals that everyone's trying to meet. I will say it again because I don't think it can be said enough. The opportunities in the commercial sector and in distribution chains are huge. I think the day that I learned that about 2/3 of the film, the plastic, think pallet wrap, stretch wrap, 2/3 of the film that is circulating around in the U.S. today is in the commercial sector, with only 1/3 of it in our homes or offices as consumers and users of packaged products. That was kind of mind-blowing for me. And I know it's not just film. Like, there's so much material out there. The data is even worse on the commercial side in terms of understanding what is flowing around and where it is, and how you might aggregate it and market it and all of those things. But lots of opportunities to kind of have a double win with both potentially switching to, say, a reusable pallet system that can utilize a lot of PCR in those pallets. And it doesn't have to be super pretty because the end consumer isn't going to scrutinize it. It stays in the distribution chain, can, do its thing with multiple uses. I don't know if he's still here. There's a guy from the Reusable Packaging Association, Tim Debus, if any of you know him or have run into him. The Reusable Packaging Association has fantastic data, particularly on distribution, around the opportunities that exist both from economic business case data as well as life cycle data. So there's, again, another opportunity to kind of turn something on in the short term that can have a major impact on your company's emissions or city's emissions and working to lower them.
Anything to add, Megan? On reuse, aluminum in the reuse space, meeting climate?
Sure. I mean, it's an area that the Ball Corporation is exploring. You guys may be familiar with boomerang water. It's essentially like a washing system and a way to use reusable aluminum bottles, and it's essentially being expanded into hotel chains and things like that. So you guys might be familiar that an aluminum can is very clearly a single-use product. But, across our packaging portfolio, we're really trying to help our customers, based on where they are in their sustainability journey, have a solution, and one of those is reusable and refillable packaging, and we're also exploring the same for our cup as well.
Cool. And this is the policy talk stage, so maybe if we can move a bit to to policy. So we need more material. We know that there's recycled content legislation happening, but what other policies are there that can support the recycling industry to get that material in a good, clean stream? I know, Megan, you had a great presentation yesterday on DRS and EPR. Do you want to maybe share a bit more on that or anything there?
Yeah, absolutely. So those of you might be familiar with, Ball partnered with Eunomia to publish the first 50 States of Recycling report back in 2021. We're currently working on an update to that report, which we're hoping will be out in the fall. And one of the things we want to do is, the 50 states did a great job in the first iteration of actually looking at what is the recovery rate or recycling rate for aluminum cans, for PET bottles, and other substrates state by state, given that states measure recycling very, very differently. But we want to take it a step further because we are hearing from policymakers and environmental NGOs who are like, great, this is great data, now what? What's the solution? How do we fix this? How do we maximize our climate goals? And so we worked with Eunomia to actually model what are the outcomes of different policies. And we did it in two very specific states. We focused on the state of Washington and the state of Colorado. And we essentially looked at if you have EPR-only policy, what are the results? And then if you pair the two policies together, what are the results? And in short, essentially, we say that because EPR is essentially a cost-shifting mechanism where you are just subsidizing curbside recycling, even if you're expanding access, you're going to likely level out recycling rates between 50 to 65%. And it's going to take between 5 to 10 years. And you guys, many of you are aware, customers of ours have goals for 2025 and 2030. So if we're slowly implementing EPR over the next 10 years, they're likely not going to be able to hit their PCR goals or their climate goals. Whereas if you pair EPR alongside a recycling refund or a deposit program on beverage containers, you're able to maximize your recovery really quickly. It's a way to prove that EPR can frankly work because deposits are an EPR for beverage packaging. And what we saw was within essentially 3 to 5 years, if it's a well-designed program, if it's convenient, you can actually hit 90% recovery. And so that's really the only pathway for us to achieve our recycling rate goals, to achieve the recycled content without having to have a bidding war for material across the globe.
I feel like, and we talk about this within the pact, if we can't drive PCR into the things that we know and that are relatively easy to put PCR into and where we know we have a lot or more supply, I should say, like beverage bottles, we're not going to be able to successfully do it for all of the other materials. And sort of the same thing for if we can't figure out how to improve the PET bottle recycling rate with the implementation of things like deposit return, because I think the data is there to show what deposit return can do for beverage containers in a relatively short amount of time and a relatively uncomplicated development process in comparison to extended producer responsibility, then we're going to just remain on the struggle bus with everything else. So the pact is supportive of extended producer responsibility for all packaging, not just plastic packaging, as well as deposit return. Again, just knowing that almost a third of all of the packaging that we have in our mix is or our PET bottles. Again, we gotta do what we know first and maximize that, and then move on to the harder things, I think. So policy is definitely needed to drive our supply.
Yeah, and deposits have a cleaner stream that can go towards recycled content much more easily than through, single stream recycling as well. So another benefit there. So I think coming towards a close, and definitely want to open it up to audience questions. So start thinking of your questions now. And we know that a lot of PCR mandates at the state level, they're state level legislation. And one state might have targets for a certain year, and their neighboring states might have targets for another year. So how does this, state by state process of recycled content mandates create maybe challenges or opportunities?
I'll take a stab first. I think if companies and how we're kind of approaching it is just looking regionally, trying to look regionally at what the requirements are, and then how do we help, set a slightly higher bar or look at the higher bar for PCR inclusion and work toward that, so that you can be in compliance and look for ways to meet that. One other thing that I want to mention before we run out of time is certification of PCR is also incredibly important to us, because we know there are shenanigans going on with existing laws, and because of lack of enforcement and lack of funds to enforce, people are calling things PCR that are definitely not PCR. So.
I think it's a really great question. I think we all would really love, I think the industry would love to see, standardization, like something at the federal level on this, so we're not playing whack-a-mole and trying to go after state-by-state regulations. Realizing that, nationwide action on this is far away, I think that's a challenge. I guess with PCR requirements, obviously, we are big proponents of driving the collection policy alongside that, so they're actually paired together to empower companies to meet those goals. I think the other thing I'll say, just because I feel like a lot of the same people are in the room, is trying to find a way, I think recycling and PCR and all these different things are unfortunately viewed as like a partisan issue, a very blue issue, a democratic issue. And so one thing that we're trying to figure out is, beyond telling the economic story and what it would do for the U.S. economy and our supply chain, especially given all the aluminum remelt capacity investments that are happening, is how do we get this to resonate with Republicans? And, one of the things that we've been talking to other customers and other suppliers, frankly, about our competitors is, can we start setting national targets and maybe even providing some sort of standardization around PCR, around what deposit implementation would look like, labeling, which we also don't like to see vary from state to state, and some of these other things, and then providing some sort of a grant incentive or something to states that do that, essentially. So providing some sort of framework at the federal level, and then some sort of a carrot so we could actually see the policies we want to see happen at the state level, is something I think others in the industry are starting to explore, simply because we just don't see an actual heavy-handed, federally organized policy coming into fruition in the near term.
Great. Any other closing thoughts? Last things to say? Final policy talk?
I think the one thing I'll say, because I realized I didn't get to it earlier, in relation to our climate transition plan, right? The aluminum industry is driving for things like unit-alloy and other decarbonization levers to try to achieve net zero, right? But according to our projections, right, that's the 2020, that's the 2050 solution versus pre-2040. And so if we as an industry can come together to figure out how do we dramatically increase recycling rates so we have the supply for PCR, I think that's what's going to help us decarbonize in the fastest way possible.
And we need PCR mandates to help rectify the economic imbalances that exist in the market. So we need the push-pull.
Thank you both very much. Any questions from the audience?
First for Megan, we always obviously talk about recycled content in the context of plastics, but would the aluminium industry like legislators to require minimum recycled content in aluminium cans? I've never asked you that before, but I just thought, I'm going to ask you.
So you're just going to put me on the spot on stage.
Yeah.
It's a good client-customer relationship, Sarah.
Just pushing the boundary a little bit.
I think it's one of those things we wouldn't mind it, right? I think the challenge is like I was saying, since aluminum so far exceeds that, current minimum standards, I don't think it's something we'd necessarily be afraid of. I would say if there was a more rigorous target for aluminum, let's say 85-90%, that's when we would want a very strong policy to drive the supply so we'd actually have access to the material.
Okay, and the question for Emily was, you touched a little bit around the kind of long-term supply contracts and floor levels. Can you talk a little bit about that work that you're doing? Because it sounds super interesting.
It's more of an awareness, Sarah, and a familiarizing of the concept with companies that are unfamiliar. I know we are seeing more, they'll remain nameless, but very large multinational consumer goods companies tying executive compensation to sustainability goals. So, I mean, things like that will drive how procurement happens. And I think just a greater awareness that I still run into a lot of folks within CPGs who have no idea how recycled commodities trade, particularly plastics. They don't understand the cycles. They don't understand the ties to virgin plastic pricing. So just an awareness of that and knowing that in order to foster the supply and the quality that they want, they need to seriously consider long-term contracts with floor prices to help level things out.
And I actually had one more thought, too. So one thing that I think is sometimes challenging when we talk about, recycling, especially when it comes to MRFs, right? Like, used beverage cans, UBCs, have the most value for a MRF. So that's the material they are targeting. So generally that means, like I was just talking to some Oregonians yesterday, aerosol cans, for example, may be taken off the recyclable list in Oregon. And, pie tins, aluminum foil, cat food cans, and aerosol cans actually have, very valuable recycled content. Like, an aerosol can has the alloy mix that could actually help us dramatically increase the recycled content of the end of a can, like the top of a can, which currently has more primary or virgin aluminum in it. So that's another reason why when we're talking about policy, doing EPR and DRS together, pulling out the beverage containers from the MRFs so the MRFs can actually increase their capture of aluminum across, the whole supply. Or the whole system. And then same thing for PET, you could go after thermoforms and other materials. I just feel like that's something that's kind of missed right now. It's like, we're really frustrated that the aluminum can recycling rate is only 45%, but other types of aluminum are even much lower. And all types of aluminum are really valuable since it's an infinitely recyclable material to help us increase our recycled content across the supply.
Thank you all for joining this morning, and thanks for joining, 5 or so talks. Thanks, Emily and Megan.